Today is Tuesday, the 31st of January 2018. I am at the very interesting North Bavarian village of Aschbach, and as I've spent the night in my motorhome, I'm now at the motorhome stellplatz here, and we're now going on a walk around the town. I say we, I mean me and you. I don't mean I've got someone else here with me, not even the dog. Now, in this little walk, we've got a few things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about history, I'm going to talk about motorhomes. But last night I was reading some articles on the press and I discovered a link between my own life and this village, which was particularly interesting for me. Now, we can see that people are leaving, and look at some of the motorhomes here, which represent in a way a cross-section of the German motorhome industry. We have Concorde, and the Concorde factory is right down there. So I visited that yesterday and I filmed some vehicles. To my left, which is now not visible, is the company Phoenix, and there's one of their motorhomes down there from someone else. I was surprised that the Phoenix production plant was so small, and Heimer from Bad Waldsee, the second largest motorhome group in Europe. And there's mine down there at the end, the sort of the poor self-built one with the funny electrical system in it, which, because it hasn't been installed yet, meant that I had a rather cold night. No, it wasn't cold, that's not true. It was alright once I got under the covers, and unfortunately didn't have to get up during the night. So, it wasn't too bad. So now, what we're going to do, we're going to have a little walk around. Now, it's a lovely, bright day, but I need to point out that it is a little bit cold, as you'd expect, for the 31st of January. And as I hold the camera, I can feel the cold biting a little bit. Well, it's nibbling more than biting. And there's the place to fill your motorhome with water and dump your dirty water. And you can dump your toilets there as well. You can hear the motorway in the background. It's quite close to here. It's a good point and bad point. It's a good point being you can get here quickly, and the bad point is you can't hear it. Personally, it doesn't bother me, but I do understand that it's not to everybody's taste. Now, this talk is going to be largely about history. Now, I'm going to talk a lot about Jewish history and the Jewish inhabitants of this town, but obviously I'm going to talk about other things as well. Including something that was going through my mind, has been going through my mind a lot, for the last couple of years in fact, which is related to Holocaust history. Now, I've published quite a lot of material on the Holocaust, and at this time I did huge amounts of research on it, but I stopped, and I questioned whether or not it was a good idea stopping. But anyway, I'll come back to that, I think, in a different film. There we have manufacturer Phoenix on the left, and you can see their motorhomes in other films which I have done. Now, I know somebody who works there invited me round, and I didn't contact earlier. I feel a bit embarrassed about it now. Fortunately, I do have the business card here. Aschbach welcomes its guests. So you see that Aschbach's part of Schlüsselfeld, which in itself is also a very attractive place to visit. I was there walking around the town on Saturday. I was talking to my mother at the same time, sort of describing to her what I was seeing, and so I didn't film it. This is the centre of the village, so to speak. So Sylvia has a hairdressing business. I note as I enter the village that there are two churches which still have services. That used to be the synagogue. Obviously, people are living in this building now. Now it's a very large building for what must have been once a small congregation. Jews, unlike Christian religions, don't tend to have enormous buildings for their places of worship. But this one, for such a small congregation, when it was built, I suspect the congregation may have been around 100 people here. I know that part of the building was used as a school, or maybe it was a building just attached to it, although by around 1923, I think it was, the Jewish children went to the same school as the non-Jewish children here. Jews made up roughly 20% of the population in the 19th century. In this area they were chiefly associated with the cattle business. Indeed, I found material in Nazi literature from the 1930s when they're attacking the Jewish control, as they put it, of the cattle industry around here. Julius Streicher, later hanged at Nuremberg in 1946, wrote about this because he was from around here. Now, the Jewish population dropped in the 20th century, I suspect largely due to, well, one reason would be people leaving, and the second reason is people converting to Protestantism largely. as a rule, I don't normally buy bread, but I did yesterday. I went to this baker here who's been on this spot since 1880 or thereabout. I spoke to the lady and she told me it's been her family since that time. On the wall inside they have the act of setting up the bakery from nearly 140 years ago. Notices from the Lutheran community. Directly in front is the war memorial, which I filmed in a separate film, so you can see that if you're interested. And up there we have a mural sort of thing with the describing the baker. On the right here we have a stone which commemorates the Jewish inhabitants of Aschbach, who in March 1942 were deported to death camps by the Nazis, and this stone was put up in 1997 by the Jewish Cultural Association community of Bavaria. As far as I'm aware, they weren't directly deported to the death camp at Auschwitz, but they went via the ghetto at Izbica, Lubelska, and some of you may be aware of my relationship with Toiva Blatt, who escaped from the Sobibor death camp in October 1943. In the film Escape from Sobibor, there was an actor playing his role, which was quite prominent in the film. But you see, I've got lots of interviews with him on my internet sites. Not just incidentally about Sobibor, but also talking about other things. Gdansk, or talking in the desert in Nevada, for example. And the point I make here is that the inhabitants from here ended up in Izbica, March or April of 1942, and from there they were sent to Auschwitz and murdered there in the gas chamber. Now, the problem was that when the German population went to a place like Izbica, there was conflict between them and the local Polish Jewish population. And this ended up with the German population would follow the orders of the German Nazi administration, whereas the Jewish Poles, would not. When they're ordered to go somewhere, they would ignore those instructions, for example, as much as they could. So the German Jews were amongst the first to be deported from Izbica because they just did as they were told. But the conflict happened within administration of the ghetto itself. Now, another problem was for the Germans who came from villages such as this and large towns such as Berlin, Vienna and others. Then they saw the terrible conditions of life that existed in the ghettos in the east, and even before the war there's been a huge difference in the standard of living. But during the war and after 3 years, nearly, or 2.5 years, Nazi occupation within Poland, and the conditions to which the Jewish population had been subjected there, quite horrendous. And not only that, but the amount of people living per room lack of access to things such as water. Now here, they could well have had water piped to their homes. They didn't have to go to wells. Whereas there, not only was they have to go to a well, but there was very little water available. Now, there wouldn't have been so much linguistic difficulties because German and Yiddish is mutually intelligible. There's no problem there whatsoever. In my opinion, I mean, the grammar is almost exactly the same. But there was a strong cultural difference. In fact, the only thing they had in common, if you like, was the fact that they were both Jewish. And I get the impression that many Polish Jews didn't really distinguish them so much from non-Jewish Germans. Now, whilst I'm on the subject of the Nazi regime, I have yet another story from Aschbach. But this comes from a later period. Now, in 2012, some of you may remember, there's a massive art hoard was found in a Munich flat belonging to one Mr. Gullet, who had been stopped at the border with Switzerland, found to have a large sum of cash in him, and when the authorities did an investigation, they found that he didn't exist, or at least not on paper. He had no tax records, social security, no nothing. And they did a raid on his flat, and inside their flat they found what was said to be more than €1 billion worth of art. Well, the investigation as the prominence of the art continues until today, but a lot of it appears to have been looted during the Second World War, and Mr. Gullet's father had claimed that a lot of it had gone up in flames during the bombing of Dresden. That probably was not true, because in June of 1945, a detachment of the Monuments Men, which was part of the Allied American and British armies, found the American detachment came here with jeeps, and they found in this castle, inhabited by Mr. Gullet's father, a huge amount of art and objets d'art, sculptures and what have you, and they confiscated it, but a lot of it Mr. Gullet got back in 1950, and I think that made up the basis of his collection that was found in the flat of his son in 2012. Now, I'm going to do a separate film on this. I'm not absolutely sure of all the details, but this is the manor house, which historically belonged to the von Pollnitz family, and on the war graves, the first person who was killed is, I suspect, maybe either the son or the grandson, because it's a von Pollnitz who's got a baronial designation, and they would have been the lords of the manor, so to speak, locally. I had to go back to my van twice. The first time because I ran out of space on the memory card, and the second time the same thing happened again. So I had to reformat the disc. But anyway, now next to the place I'm staying at, the motorhome stellplatz, to use the German word, is the word in French, which we often use in English. We have the cemetery. So here we have one. But I'm going to show you the Jewish cemetery, which is up the top here, and which you can see in another film, although you can't see the Christian cemetery in another film because I didn't film it. other than what I'm doing now. So to the right we have the motorway, and then we have the Concorde factory, and here we have Jewish cemetery. The cemetery was in use from 1720 until I believe the last burial was 1947. And as we see in many cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries in Germany, first of all we've got a list of the victims of the Nazi period, and it also mentions the first victim, who was, you see his name down there, Mr. Sussman, who was murdered in Dachau in 1939, aged either 49 or 50. I believe, I might have got this wrong, but there was somebody who was arrested for alleged tax fraud, something which other similar regimes have used in the past to accuse people of financial irregularities as a means of trying to steal their possessions. And there was at least 2 cases that I know of like that here in Aschbach. When I'm unable to comment if they are trumped up charges or if it were true, of course, I don't know. And here we can see a little bit about, here we can see the amount of gravestones, Matzeva, in Hebrew, which is very impressive. And there was an article in Süddeutsche Zeitung, I think it was, in 2007, somebody broken in, 3 kids had broken in, I think 17 and 18 years old, and they've caused several thousand euros worth of damage. I say broken in, it doesn't take much to get over the wall here. It's very low. Indeed, had the gate been locked, I suppose I'd have just gone over the wall. And I see my van, and next to it there's the Concorde factory. My idea had been to do a separate film on the Jewish origins of Aschbach, and maybe I put it all in one place though, except for the individual films that I've done, such as did this cemetery in a little bit more depth, spoke about the prisoners of war, and I'm thinking of doing something on the art theft as well, which touches Aschbach. So it's now about 13:15, something like that. The stellplatz is empty except for me, and I'm now about to leave. I'd like to say that I've had a really nice time in this area. I've been here for several days. I wasn't here all the time. I was at another place earlier, and a very pleasant area of North Bavaria. And let's bear in mind that it's winter. Okay, today's an exceptionally superb day. The other days the sky wasn't so blue, so if you see some other films, it's not such good weather. I didn't film Schlüsselfeld, but that can wait for another time. At Aschbach here, to me, this has been a really wonderful stay here, and I found very interesting things I was able to do, such as, for example, with the palace. I went to see finding the synagogue still standing here. That for me was quite wonderful. And the cemetery, Jewish cemetery, how many matzeva are still there. And the cemetery which will be nearly 300 years old. In fact, it will be 300 years old the year after next. So, now time to get back into the van. I'm going to head towards Bamberg. I'm not quite certain where I'm going exactly. I'll probably stop somewhere off en route, but that's the general idea.